Move to our first proper roundtable, where Dana stays on, and we add 4 speakers. This roundtable is titled Inseparable Futures, Ukrainian Security as European Security. The overarching question is, what do we need to guarantee Ukrainian and European security? But we go deeper. We want to better understand where the war comes from, the current moment, and prospects for the future. Our first speaker will be Kostiantyn Gorobets, Kostya. Kostya is an assistant professor at the University of Groningen, from which he also obtained his PhD, and he was previously an associate professor of law at the Odessa Law Academy. Kostya is a legal philosopher by training. At the core of Kostya's work focuses on the authority of international law, and one of your projects from which we will hear today focuses on the notion of Russia's imperial legality and Russian approaches to international law. Our second speaker will be Viktoriia Lapa. Viktoriia is a lecturer in international law at Bocconi University, from which she also holds a PhD, Bocconi in Milan. Her scholarly work focuses on international trade law and especially the role of security exceptions within it. And she has also written on the Ukrainian constitution, Ukraine's commitment to NATO membership, and so on. Viktoriia previously worked as a public prosecutor in Ukraine and in legal practice. And I must say, Viktoriia is a friend, and since the war, she has been organizing many solidarity and fundraising initiatives in support of Ukraine in Milan, including a beautiful, they have met every year in the main square, every day in the main square of Milan for more than a year, and you still meet every Saturday, really remarkable. The third speaker is Nicole Scicluna. Nicole joins us from far away, from Hong Kong. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Government and International Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University, after having obtained a PhD from La Trobe University in Melbourne. Nicole has published widely in the area of EU integration, European politics and EU foreign relations, and her work especially traces the interaction between international EU law and politics. Among her publications, I want to mention her textbook, Politics of International Law, from Oxford University Press 2021, and a very interesting article, Pushing the EU's Boundaries and Enlargement and Foreign Policy Activeness After the Russian Invasion of Ukraine, on the Journal of Common Market Studies. Our fourth speaker is Natasha Stamenkovikj. Natasha is a lecturer in European Studies at the Humanities Department here at the University of Amsterdam, and she holds a PhD from Tilburg University in the Netherlands. She has previously taught at Tilburg and also worked in private practice. Natasha is a human rights and external relations lawyer, and her work focuses primarily on victim rights in post-war context, the notion of transitional justice and how it was implemented in the Western Balkans. Today, Natasha will discuss whether the idea of transitional justice can be helpful in the context of the war in Ukraine. So we have around an hour and 45 minutes. Our speaker will each speak for an initial pitch of 8 to 10 minutes. I will be stricter now, and then we move on into a discussion. Kostya, why don't you start?
Thank you very much, Giacomo. We'll try to stick to 8 minutes. So thank you very much for having me. And yeah, as you mentioned, I'm doing legal philosophy, particularly philosophy of international law, and this is the kind of a perspective that I will be speaking from today. So normally, and in this conference in particular already, the conversation about threats and security is conceptually localized to the issues of war, obviously when it comes to Russia, and how it looms over the European Union and can even necessitate its active participation in the hostilities. And this, of course, makes sense, but in order to have a better notion of the nature of this threat, I believe it is necessary to look at its ideological and legal structures, and this is something that my current project is about. So as the introduction to this conference is delivered by Giacomo points out, the EU has for decades been operating within this very specific geopolitical view that the era of large European wars is over and that peace and prosperity is the kind of a new normal. And I believe that to a large extent, this view has been informed by the trust in a specific ideology of international legality. So the general prohibition of the use of force introduced in the UN Charter, coupled with legal obligations under the NATO, and the overall idea of the triumph of law over war have underlain the EU's perception that as long as legality is preserved through the commitment to the rule of law, strong institutions, the wars can be avoided. And of course, this ideology is not unique to the EU. It underlies the whole project of liberal internationalism. So this view is, to me, openly legalistic in a sense that at first it takes the law to be one of the central elements, if not the central element, of the system of collective security. And second, it assumes that security and military threats are to be or can be framed primarily through the language of universally binding rules, rationality, and so on and so on. So for quite some time, and especially through the 90s and 2010s, it was also believed that Russia's view of international legality is largely similar. So hence the idea of democratization through and liberalization through trade, which it also did not follow the fashion even after the invasion of Georgia in 2008, annexation of Crimea in 2014, and slow burning war in the east of Ukraine from 2014 onwards. So this legalistic outlook that I just outlined assumes that these were anomalies in overall rule-governed conduct and rule-governed rationality, that Russia operates within more or less the same frame of reference, but it just allows itself certain extravagancies and power play. So what I would like to argue, and this is sort of the central point of my current project, is that the full-scale invasion of Ukraine of 2022 has exposed the reality that Russia attempts to construct what I call alternative legality, and its potential success in achieving it is what fundamentally underlies security and military threats that Russia possesses for the EU, perhaps a bit more so than direct military invasion, as was just asked about. Okay, but Russia could not overtake Ukraine in 1,000 days. So what are we really afraid of? So allow me to unpack a little what I mean by alternative legality here and what is special about the threat that it manifests, I think. So one of the first knee-jerk reactions to the invasion back in 2022, coming from most European states and institutions, and this is still largely the dominant narrative, is that Russia doesn't just act illegally by violating some fundamental rules of international law, but that it threw international legality out of window altogether, that its action cannot meaningfully be described in legal terms at all. Now, of course, this claim is aimed at preempting any possible justification coming from Russia, because once again, within the legalistic outlook, any tangible lawfulness conjures legitimacy. So, and yet again, with this legalistic outlook, the message has been framed in the language of rules. Russia does not play by the rules, that its arguments have no merits under the rules of international law, that rules must be the ultimate criterion for state conduct and rationality, and so on. In this rule-centric view, the UN Charter, for instance, is taken largely as representation of certain universal and generally applicable norms grounded in territorial sovereignty, integrity, sovereign equality, the prohibition of the use of force, and so on. Now, the way that Russia has been using international law to ground and justify the invasion does not indeed square within this paradigm. So for once, there is hardly any direct engagement with specific rules or norms of international law or their interpretation. And I'm not talking here about diplomatic or political speeches. If we look at the Russian Constitutional Court judgments on the annexation of Ukrainian regions from October 2022, so this is the legal elite that supposedly writes those judgments, there was this peculiar thinness of what one would normally expect from legal judgments. Yeah? Instead of deducing rights and obligations from rules, their interpretations, Russia grounds them directly in historical narration. So leaving aside the accuracy of that narration, because ultimately that doesn't really matter for Russia, what is important here is that this represents a strategy of legalization in its own right. And I think this is a very important conceptual threat. So this legalization is achieved not so much by means of subsuming some conduct under the normative abstractions, as legalism would require, and this is how we train lawyers to act, but legalization that sees history as the direct representation of legal rights and obligations. So the UN Charter here appears not as a set of rules as abstract generalization of conduct, but as a representation of a particular historical compromise, which is perfectly compatible with imperialism, by the way. So in this way, Russia resists this legalistic strategy of abstracting the normative content from the Charter and seeks to deduce its legal claims regarding Ukraine and also ultimately the whole of Eastern and parts of Central Europe from specific historical events and a very specific mode of narration. And this is why I believe the whole talk of Nazis, for instance, in Ukraine, which seems bizarre and nonsensical to most people and decision maker, is so critical because it allows Russia to argue that the so-called special military operation is just a continuation of exercise of self-defense against Nazism, like as a continuous action. As Timothy Snyder argued in Road to Freedom, the West is not a threat because of what it does. West is a threat because this is where Nazis came from in 1945. So this strategy of legalization also allows Russia to present Eastern and part of Central Europe as what constitutes near abroad, where Russia has a legal right and even obligation to prevent interferences into internal affairs. And these techniques and strategies of legalization that Russia develops, in contrast to Western Europe in particular, present, I think, a much more far-reaching challenge that is normally acknowledged. It is not only what Russia does that should be considered the threat, or what can it potentially do in military terms, to which Europe should supposedly awaken, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, how it sees what it does. So how it seeks to develop this justificatory frame, this alternative legality, which gives it an exclusive access to legal claims and arguments that no other state can potentially make. And speaking of awakening, awakening is an interesting metaphor, I think, because I don't know how people in the audience, I always struggle with awakening. The pull to stay asleep, to stay in bed for a little longer can be just a little bit too strong. And here I think it is another element to this, right? Because it is very easy to fall into this ideological illusion that the legalistic structure, the legalistic way of doing law and seeing law and practicing law is the only one available, and that there is no other alternatives that can exist. The actions of strategic adversaries could then be perceived on this angle only as nonsensical, as bizarre, as irrational. So this non-rule-centric form of political and legal conduct, I think, which Russia is trying to put forward, which also ultimately leads to establishment of these various bubbles of legality, each operating under different criteria of effectiveness and legitimacy, is a long-term danger that needs to be resisted by the EU in particular. So I will stop here. I hope that I'm within time.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Kostya. We now move on to Viktoriia Lapa.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for inviting me and for organizing this conference. I was already mentioning that this is actually a very important time, I think, when you organize this conference, because apparently the conference is discussing in general the Russian aggression against Ukraine were kind of on rise in 2022, then a bit in 2023, but then kind of I think this urgency and this awakening started to go away, and now unfortunately there is no maybe kind of a lot of urgency on this topic, but maybe with the elections in the US, this topic has been revived. And I wanted to maybe start my speech by actually replying to the question of Professor Fabbrini. So you ask, well, maybe it's not really a threat because Ukraine was able, for 1,000 days to stand for Russian aggression, and so Russia is not that big threat for Europe. But my response will be, well, what is the price for those 1,000 days? I think this photo is really a very exemplary, because people like us, a professor of civil law in Kyiv University, Alexander Polivotsky, who was 50 years old, he went to the front line. My friend, who was a lawyer, he went to the front line. Both of them were killed. And I think we have to understand, is Europe ready to stand for 1,000 days? Is Europe ready to pay this price? So that's why I think we have to take that into account as well. So that's why 1,000 days, but enormous sacrifice by people like us. And I think I will start actually by kind of connecting to that response by saying that, well, now we have a big kind of challenge for Europe, for European security. Because we have to understand this war of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, it was not only about Ukraine. And Professor already said that in his introductory speech about Russian aggression against Georgia in 2008. Indeed, it went kind of almost unnoticed. Russia was not even sanctioned. But Russia didn't stop in Georgia, it went further. And so now we have this big challenge for Europe So how can we ensure peace and security in Europe and also maintain future peace deal, which maybe Trump would push Ukraine to agree on with Russia in Ukraine? So my presentation, and I will put actually a timer, so I don't want to exceed 8 minutes. So my presentation would be actually on this kind of idea of the European path to security, and I truly believe that the Ukrainian peace is indivisible from the European security, and that's why there are kind of two elements and two arguments in my presentation with regard to the future of the European security. Because first of all, when we'll have any type of deal between Ukraine and Russia, we would need to think, well, how to maintain that peace, okay? Because we have already 2 Minsk agreements. We know that they have never worked out, and Ukraine does not want to have Minsk III. And this is a question for Europe, how Europe can actually maintain that peace. And that's why I think now there are many discussions on this, and many articles are trying to ask, will Europe be able to defend itself with less support maybe from the US? And how to maintain that peace deal in Ukraine? And I think what it means, for Ukraine, it means security guarantees. And I think we have to discuss that Europeans should be prepared to send its troops as a guarantee for the peace deal in Ukraine. And there are some already articles and kind of discussions among Baltic countries and some Nordic partners. So there is an alliance of countries who started to discuss that. Of course, it's still kind of just kind of in the air. But I think Europe should start to think of this, because Ukraine, we all should remember that in 1994, Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in that famous Budapest Memorandum. And countries like Russia, and also including US and UK, they actually also signed that they will respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. And so Ukraine has already signed some deals. And Ukraine already took some commitments. So if it takes another commitment, and if we are entering into a peace deal, who will guarantee that? And I think this is really very important, because there are already security agreements between Ukraine and EU and G7 partners, which are kind of with regard to the providing military support for Ukraine, but of course they don't have this possibility of military troops. And I think we have to at least discuss this. Again, Estonians, they are saying that of course it will be very hard without the US, but we have to think about it, and Ukrainians cannot, fight till the very last Ukrainian. And Europe should understand that in order for support of this peace deal, it should have also its kind of guarantee. And then it leads me to my second argument and second element of this European security, which is about kind of the European society, how European society can understand these threats to the European security, and how basically we can prepare in general our society for new challenges which it has. And I was inspired actually by the Dutch Admiral Rob Bauer, who is now a chair of the NATO Military Committee. And he, in some of his interviews, he was alluding to this idea of the whole society approach to security. And I will cite him when he was saying that basically, for a long time, society has outsourced external defense to the armed forces and internal defense to the police. But the defense is not only about 2% of GDP. And it's not only about the money, it's also about the people. If we need to find new soldiers, it's not the problem of the Ministry of Defense, it's a problem of all of us. You are part of the solution. And he was saying that the private sector for 80 years did not have to think about, is my factory there tomorrow morning? Because it was a given. The security was always there. And therefore, it was not longer the part of considerations. But now they have to understand that it is in their strategic interest to invest in defense. And he kind of also goes further when he is also explaining and expanding on that, well, that strong deterrence requires strong societal resilience, that it requires participation from all governmental institutions, from private sectors and citizens. And that's why kind of he says that while it may be the military who wins battles, it's the economies that win wars. And I think I am going kind of to end my presentation by saying that we also have a role as professors, as scholars to play in this kind of whole society approach. We have to raise these questions with our students. We have to explain that kind of resilience, you know, and defense should be taken seriously, that it's not only for military, but it's also for the society to play a role in kind of supporting this whole defense endeavor, which we have to play a role into it. And I will kind of end by saying that, well, Europe cannot really afford to continue to live with this as long as it takes policy. Because, yes, there was this awakening in 2022, but I think like it was really very fastly, urgency was kind of fading away. And that's why I think Europe should adopt an active strategy to maintain future peace in Ukraine and also implement a whole society approach to its defense inside Europe. Because we can not longer pretend that kind of Russia would disappear tomorrow, even if the peace is done tomorrow. Russia will still be there. And if we allow Russia to kind of pursue its policy and attack Ukraine again, if we have a so-called Minsk III, which wouldn't have any real security guarantee on the ground in Ukraine, I think we are making a very big mistake and sending a very bad signal to other countries like Iran, like China, and North Korea, and this is actually a very bad kind of solution for the future generations in Europe. So thanks a lot, and I hope I was not.
Perfect timing again. We now move on to Nicole.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me? I'm not sure if the microphone reaches okay. Okay, all right. Okay, so yeah, thank you to Giacomo for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So this is a very broad panel, but for my intervention, I want to focus on enlargement more specifically, right? So on the prospect of EU enlargement to Ukraine. Not so much in terms of the kind of minutiae, the kind of details of what that process would involve, but more in a kind of macro sense. But also in a way, I have to start by acknowledging that this is kind of putting the cart before the horse, because in what sense can we talk? I mean, the EU is talking about enlargement and has been since 2022, but how concretely can you talk about that at all before the war is actually resolved, right? So, but anyway, that's what I want to try to talk about. So I want to start by briefly framing the issue in terms of EU enlargement, basically since the end of the Cold War, and you know, to refer to Karen Smith, who wrote an article back in 2005, and she wrote that basically ever since the end of the Cold War, the EU has faced the essential dilemma over where its final borders are. You know, what is the kind of how much can the EU expand? Where are its final borders? And she referred to this as the EU's exclusion-inclusion dilemma, right? Mm-hmm. Ultimately, who's in and who's out, right? And so the EU largely dealt with that dilemma by choosing inclusion, but without ever decisively demarcating the final borders. So that was kept blurry, that was kept fuzzy, which often was seen as a virtue, right? So the borders are kind of porous, open. But on the whole, the EU went with inclusion, right? So anyway, as we know, in the post-Cold War period, the EU did undergo a period of large-scale expansion, right? So starting with the Big Bang enlargement in 2004, and then Romania and Bulgaria, and then Croatia. So that was the most recent in 2013. So in that time, the EU expanded from 15 to 28. But then since 2013, you know, there's been a period of what has been described as kind of enlargement fatigue, right? So, and what does this mean? This is basically a marked kind of deprioritization of the enlargement agenda, never like closed off, right? Never kind of completely taken off the table, but a deprioritization since 2013. So, you know, the remaining candidate states in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe, it's not that they're kind of European perspective, right, to use that EU terminology. It's not that that was ever closed off. And in fact, certainly for the Western Balkans, eventual EU membership has been promised since 2003, actually. But still, concrete progress certainly stalled, right, towards that goal. And it stalled for the Western Balkans, which have been, you know, promised that eventual outcome. But so for the countries on the EU's eastern borders, and obviously above all focusing on Ukraine here, the situation was less certain. Okay, so Ukraine had been covered by various iterations of the Eastern Partnership, right, which is also what Karen Smith wrote about then. And you know, the Eastern Partnership was a kind of limbo as far as EU membership goes, right? You know, the realizability of that membership as the eventual goal was neither kind of explicitly confirmed nor denied, right? So it's a kind of limbo. So, and this is where I think enlargement connects to security, right? So in terms of its effect on Ukraine's security, this limbo, it's not just that it's proved untenable, it was actually really disastrous, right? It was really disastrous. So, and here I would refer back to the chain of events that led to the Maidan Revolution in 2014 and then Russian annexation of Crimea. So a key trigger, right, for the ouster of Yanukovych was he's backtracking on the EU association agreement, right, that Ukraine was supposed to sign the association agreement and then Yanukovych dropped that. Okay, so this I think is a really kind of tragic irony as regards the EU's foreign policy activeness and the EU's power, right? You know, an association agreement is something, right? But it's not EU membership. It's not even the promise of EU membership, right? It's something, but it's something else. So, you know, the EU was kind of powerful enough to at least partly trigger a revolution in Ukraine, and then, you know, that starts a chain of events that also leads to the annexation of Crimea, but not powerful enough to, you know, stop the annexation of Crimea or reverse it or ever seriously contemplate reversing it, you know, so not powerful enough to protect Ukraine's territorial integrity. So, you know, it kind of offered Ukraine just enough that Putin would fear Ukraine being pulled out of Russia's orbit, but not enough to actually pull Ukraine out of Russia's orbit. So they're like kind of the worst of you know, both possibilities. So, yeah, and then the other part of that tragic irony is that it took the full-scale invasion in February 2022 for the EU to formally commit to Ukraine's European perspective, right, the eventual goal of actual EU membership. So Ukraine submitted its application for candidacy just a few days after the invasion in February 2022, and it was accepted in June, right, which in EU terms is like unprecedented speed. And then the accession negotiations began in June of this year, 2024. So, you know, none of this would have happened if not for the war. Right, none of this would have happened. So, you know, enlargement is back on the EU's agenda, and it's kind of back in a big way. And yet, there remains this serious gap between like the rhetoric and the reality, right? So, and that gap, I think, between the rhetoric and reality basically continues to jeopardize Ukraine's security and via that, Europe's security, the EU security. So now, just very briefly, I just want to, this is something that I've started looking at for a project, right? This kind of rhetoric-reality gap that I've just started, so I can't give a kind of detailed analysis. But I'm kind of looking at how enlargement has come back on the agenda. And one way I'm looking at it is through public speeches and statements given by Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President. So just to give you a surface level statistic, right? If you look at all the speeches she's given, so von der Leyen's term in office, it's kind of almost half, not exactly half, but almost exactly half before and after the February 2022 invasion, right? So just a surface level statistic, right? If you just look for speeches that she's given that mention the word enlargement, there are 52, I found 52. Only 7 of them are before February 2022, right? So the vast majority are since. That's not that no one was talking about enlargement, but it was like the commissioner was talking about it, or sometimes it was followed, right? It wasn't a sort of underline. But now she is talking about it, right, in a big way. And just so, for example, if you look at her State of the Union addresses as an example, so 2020, 2021, there's no mention of enlargement at all in the State of the Union address. In 2022, she actually doesn't use the word enlargement, but there is a kind of short passage that makes the point that the Western Balkans, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia are part of the European family and the future is in Europe. And then by contrast, the 2023 State of the Union address has a kind of whole dedicated subsection on enlargement, right? It's a whole section of the speech in which she exhorts, von der Leyen is exhorting her colleagues to get to work on, quote, completing our union. So actually, finally, decisively setting final borders, right? Completing, so not just expanding, but completing our union. Okay, so just very briefly before I finish then, to contrast that, so something else I'm looking at is references to enlargement in the European Parliament. And what I've started with is looking at the manifestos that the EP party groups issued before European elections. So again, this is just some initial stuff, right? But if you look back before the 2019 European parliamentary election, and there were 6 party groups that issued manifestos. And across those 6, there's just kind of one, the ALDE, which then was renamed Renew, there's one reference to enlargement, right, across all 6. So it's basically not there at all. By contrast, for 2024, and again, there were 6 party groups, and the same 6, I can give details later, that issued manifestos. All 6 of them discuss enlargement, all 6, but in very mixed terms, So the Renew and Greens manifestos are the most clearly positive. The ECR and left group ones are the least positive. But so the 2 kind of main party groups, the EPP and S&D, are kind of lukewarm. And the one thread that runs through all of them is an emphasis on the requirement that all candidates must meet all accession criteria in full, which, if I can just refer to what Kostya is talking about, I think is a kind of example of the EU adherence to legalism, which I think is sometimes like a convenient cover for not taking decisive political action, right? So can't do any kind of fast-tracked accession because it's against the rules. So, okay, well, that's the end of that conversation, right? It's against the rules. So where does this leave Ukraine? And I come now to my conclusion. It leaves Ukraine still in limbo, right? So if there can be no compromise on meeting all of the accession criteria in full, then realistically, Ukraine is decades away from joining. So if Ukraine's EU membership is a geopolitical imperative, as someone like von der Leyen would put it, then the approach to the accession criteria, maybe amongst other things, needs to be rethought. But is it? Is it a geopolitical imperative? So, and this is just my intuition, but it seems to me that one of the factors that kind of underlies this gap between rhetoric and reality is actually a mismatch in perceptions over how urgent Ukraine's membership is and the Ukraine issue is in general. And unfortunately, I have to agree with some of what Viktoriia was just saying, like, the urgency fades, right? And it's like there's a war fatigue in Europe. Europe's not even fighting the war, and there's a war fatigue. So, unfortunately, this is not a very positive conclusion. But, I think that's, Ukraine remains in limbo unless, there's a lot that the EU can't do, right? But enlargement is one of the things that it should be able to do. So if it can't even do that, then Ukraine is still in limbo. I'll finish there.
We now go to Natasha.
Yes. So thank you, Giacomo, for inviting me to give my thoughts for this panel. The injustice of being lost in the row is that basically all the people mentioned most of my arguments, but I'll still try to be unique as possible. My contribution, with timer on, my contribution to this panel is in the sense of transitional justice, because that's what I work on. So I kind of shift the focus from security to justice and the paradigm of security versus justice and justice versus security, which has been on the floor for years and decades. So briefly, what is transitional justice? Well, transitional justice is the process that transforms society from non-democratic systems and regimes and standards to a democratic, self-sustaining society. This is most notable in societies that come out of war or out of autocratic regimes. And I'll stop there on the definition of transitional justice because I don't have time. But the important point is that normally transitional justice is applied in post-conflict timing rather than during conflict. However, there have been examples where transitional justice is being applied during conflict, and it is used as a tool to kind of shape the basis for society to then proceed after the conflict as a self-sustaining democratic regime. This is usually done with peace negotiation processes, where basically the transitional justice framework of standards for human rights protection, democratization, rule of law, and impunity fighting are being put on the table, on the negotiating table, as standards that will need to be fulfilled for society to continue with peace later on. And instances where transitional justice has been used during this kind of peace negotiations processes is the country that I come from, North Macedonia or Colombia, right? So this is the most recent narrative of transitional justice. The main point with the process is that the main goal and objectives of transitional justice is to establish peace and to establish justice. So this is important. I'm pointing this out for further on in my presentation. Now, where the EU lies in this kind of idea of transitional justice? Well, transitional justice, more or less in legal terms, was nowhere to be found in the EU framework. However, the basis of transitional justice in the EU starts with the values. The establishing values of the EU, Article 2, we all know them, democracy, rule of law, human rights, and respect for international law. But the EU has gone further than that. The EU adopted in 2015, November, adopted a strategy on transitional justice. This strategy is not intended to be a self-sustaining policy. It is intended to provide a legal basis and political basis for transitional justice standards to be applied in EU peacekeeping missions and peace management missions. Now, I make the distinction between peacekeeping and peace management or peace establishing because peacekeeping is boots on the ground, but EU's boots on the ground for years have involved a peace management process, and this is where transitional justice elements come to play. Now, without going into much details, I can do that during the Q&A session. The legal basis for the transitional justice strategy is Article 2 together with Article 21, which is the establishing values of the EU, and the article that regulates the EU's external actions, especially when it comes to peace terms, as well as Article 49, which we all know is the membership article. Basically, every country has to be aligned with human rights system norms, democracy, rule of law, etc., in order to join the EU. So we see that the focus of the EU when it comes to transitional justice is in its external kind of side or external role of the EU as a global actor. Now, this strategy hasn't seen much light since its establishment. It hasn't been really mentioned in any policy documents or in any missions, but it is based on around 12 principles. Few of them are very important. I'm going to focus on 2-3 main in order to assess how this applies in the Ukraine context. So I'll start with the good news. What EU has done pretty well is it has based this strategy on the principle of victim-centered approach, as well as human rights-centered approach. This is the more contemporary notion of transitional justice, because previously transitional justice was mostly focused on the perpetrators, and now it's shifting towards its restorative model of victim inclusiveness. But the EU has gone further from the victim inclusiveness into victim focus transitional justice. And this means not only acknowledging victims and their victimhood and urging their participation into the peace processes, but what EU has done better is that it puts as not an incentive, but as a standard for transitional justice framework to apply, that victims should also be integrated into the societal processes where they are. And this in practice we saw with the policy that EU undertook regarding the refugees from Ukraine, where it opened the doors for them to go into societies, but also it instigated programs for their integration within those societies through education, integration trainings, etc. In this sense, EU has learned its lessons from the debacle of 2016 and 2017 refugee crisis in the Balkans. Now, what the EU hasn't done so well is the principle of comprehensive and timely transitional justice. When it comes to timely, these are kind of correlated. When it comes to timely application of transitional justice, there is one problem when it comes to the case of Ukraine, which was already kind of mentioned. The peace negotiation processes are nowhere to be found. So there is a whole step that has been jumped. And this is the most crucial step to establish the basis for transitional justice or transitioned to justice society when it comes to Ukraine. And when it comes to kind of the comprehensiveness of the transitional justice processes, this is linked to it because aspects such as children's rights, gender mainstreaming, a recognition of women as participants in transforming the society, but also as specifically vulnerable victims in conflict. These are aspects that are put within the core of the new society at the peace negotiation table. And the most notable case for that is the Irish peace negotiation processes. And by skipping this step, EU basically applied urgent, possibly efficient effort to transitional justice, but questionably if it will be efficacious. So efficient, but not necessarily effective. And also the comprehensiveness of the framework is also harshly narrowed down to the very imminent threats. So to proceed from here to my last point, so what did the EU offer instead of this kind of comprehensive transitional justice? Well, it offered membership, right? But this is another issue that the EU hasn't learned a lesson from because, as it was already mentioned, the membership has been put on the table into the transitional justice processes as part of the peace negotiation processes in North Macedonia, for example, since 2003, where the Ohrid Agreement was signed, but there has been no movement from that. The carrot of membership did rot for 2 decades. So in my opinion, EU is to be praised for the victim-centered approach, but that is a limited one towards the refugees. The problem is, however, that the EU has given carrot that is doomed to rot, that Ukraine can technically not bite from, as the previous speaker said, so I won't elaborate more on that. But it is an aspect to consider that without peace negotiation processes, there is no possibility for transitional justice, and especially for sustainable peace and justice delivery in Ukraine. And this is also where EU, I think, should be more active as well. Thank you.
So, Dana, would you like to come in with some reactions or first open to the audience?
Why don't you do it first?
All right. So why don't people from the audience come in? They've been patiently waiting. I'm sure there's questions we can collect. Or yes, Maria. I think if you speak.
Can I just speak?
Yeah, I think if you speak loud.
Okay.
Do we stop your recording? Okay. Yeah.
So thank you very much, everyone. My question is for Kostya Gorobets. Because your talk triggered a thought process in my head, which I'm still not able to resolve, and I'm wondering if you can help me with that. So I think you made some very apt observations about, Russia not being part of Western international liberal rationality and the way they think about law, their historical experience with statehood and with legal systems is radically different from the Western world, I would say. And so I share the analysis that there is something wrong in assuming that they would, they would sort of be part of that conversation. But I struggle to see the difference between basically saying, well, they are not following the rules, that basically their action is illegal, and which is something that you suggested was not the right way to think about it, and the other story that you offered, which was basically to understand that they have their own alternative legalities based on their own historical interpretations of history, which are obviously used in a highly strategic and cynical way. What do we gain with that understanding? I mean, I'm just, what is the difference between saying, well, the Russians are just basically not playing the game of international law, and as we understand it, they're it's illegal, based on that framework, and saying, well, they're engaging in their own constructions of legality, and we must sort of recognize that. What do we gain with that counter narrative? That would be my question. Thanks.
Great. Other questions? And I invite maybe our students as well to, if they want to come in. No pressure, but we'd love to. Paula, did you have a question?
Yes. It's mainly a question to Natasha, but maybe some others have. Because I think we struggle a lot with this conflict, but also with the others in the neighborhood of decoupling some military security and human security issues. And I think that's something that we normally see that, providing kind of any basic, even humanitarian assistance in terms of guaranteeing any sort of human security is not seen as neutral with regard to the more military security aspects of the conflict, and whether you see any prospects of how can the EU, for instance, in this case, do that without peace talks, or whether that's something that makes sense, because I think that's something that we struggle a lot with, or that's blocking the efforts towards more guaranteeing some sort of human security in the meantime.
Anyone else? Or yes, Kaki.
Yes, thank you very much. This is extremely interesting. Sorry, I will stand up. And it's not a very full-fledged question. It's more probably that I would like to hear a little bit more about, and for Nicole, but actually I think for any of you, if you want to answer, is whether you think that enlargement, so now being back on the agenda, but sort of what I also understand from you is none of the actors know how to proceed with that. But doesn't it also have to do with the fact that the EU has not had the capacity to absorb and also do anything with the past 20 years that this big bang enlargement also took place? So what has happened within the EU, integrating these countries? Because what we see is that if we talk about the economy, then we look to the West. If we talk about democracy and rule of law, then we look to the East, and then something around enlargement comes. But some kind of more complex thinking within the EU doesn't take place. So I also, when I think about enlargement, that I would now have to think very hard which DG it is, but it's a very much separated, isolated part. It doesn't mainstream to other policies. Is this clear? But yeah, okay, thank you.
Great. And Anna?
It's a question and a comment. Is that okay?
Absolutely, yes.
So thank you very much for this panel. I think it's very timely and interesting and important. My brother-in-law died last year on the front line in Ukraine, so that would be important to talk about this. And I want to say one comment to Viktoriia. So you very importantly highlighted the importance of also a civil society approach to understand also us in European countries, that we have to not only outsource it to our military. And you see so much variety in this, right? So you see, for instance, countries like Finland and Sweden, like Sweden sends a brochure to all of its citizens what to do in times of war. Finland has a whole of society approach. here in the Netherlands, this is a problem. We are a very individualist country, and there are slowly things, happening, but I understand that there actually will be even a brochure sent out here to Dutch citizens now. So the Ministry of Defense is working on that, so I'm curious how that would be. My question is, and it's actually building a bit on what Kavi was saying, and that is, what about a threat from within the EU? So we're talking about geopolitical threats and awakening, but before our eyes is unfolding, populism, right-wing movements, and it might crumble. I mean, being extremely crumble the EU from the inside, and this might also affect again how we look towards Ukraine. So I know it's very hard to find any solutions there, but I would like you to reflect on some of these issues and how you think it might impact.
Okay, so
Yeah, do you want to come in?
Well,
Thank you.
are there more questions? I mean,
We can make a second round, maybe. We still have around half an hour, so we can maybe take your question.
maybe there were questions directly to these
Okay,
people,
so-
and but I did want to.
Okay, absolutely. So we go let's go in the order. Kostya.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions and for the comments. So what do we gain by doing that? I think the answer to this question is multifold. So I think that primarily there are like direct normative risks here involved, right? So we're risking fragmentation of international law if it ever being universal, right? So I think we're now shifting into this reality where there are different bubbles of legality, each operating under its own criteria for what counts as a valid and persuasive legal argument. And how do those bubbles coexist? Can they coexist? Should they be engaging with one another or not? Should they be kept apart, so to speak? I think this is an interesting question, not only from a conceptual point of view, but from a practical point of view as well. Oftentimes, it is also a question of audience, right? And this is something that people often tell me, well, those arguments are made by Russians for a specific audience, primarily for internal audience. But okay, that might be an intended audience, but this is not the only audience to which those arguments reach. Some countries in the global south, China as well, they are actually buying into those arguments and they're using it for bolstering their own claims. And that is a direct strategic risk. And another point here is, well, we know how Western imperialism has been using international law largely. So how the rules-based international order, for instance, being utilized in order to achieve certain imperialistic aims. But what about non-imperialistic engagements with international law, especially when they are grounded in direct rejection of some of the liberal internationalist ideas, such as rule of law, for instance? That is something that is not being worked out yet, I think, and this is something that is being completely new, I think. That reminds me of Valery Zorkin, the head of the Russian Constitutional Court, when in summer 2022 at some conference he said, "Oh, there is this problem that we have with the West when our Western colleagues say, oh, we did not really put in writing that we do not enlarge NATO. We kind of, made it oral, something like that. We just said it, and therefore it doesn't count for anything." And he said, well, this argument, that didn't happen, but in Zorkin's view, that argument shows that the Western countries do not see the difference between written law and what he calls in Russian beautiful word, подлинное право, as a real, true law. What is that real true law? What is it? What is its mechanics? What is its anatomy, so to speak? I think there is a lot to be learned about that. And I think this question matters not less than Nazi law was studied, to understand why it worked and how it worked.
Natasha.
Okay. Thank you, Paula, for your question. Yes, normally, when there is no chance for peace negotiations to happen at the moment, what can we do is the question. Well, first of all, we can try to instigate peace negotiations from the ground on. The most successful peace negotiations that have happened when transitional justice happens during conflict, and that is most notably the case of Colombia, is when the negotiations are not used to stop the conflict, so that the groups cannot restructure, regroup, and gain on strength. But the conflicts are used, the peace negotiations are used to kind of maneuver towards democracy starting from the conflict on without allowing the parties to kind of regroup. And that also happened in Macedonia. Now, these things come with sacrifice. The thing that the EU can kind of do is keep the question of peace and negotiations open, but in the means of including all actors, so different actors, not only government from Russia, but people, elites from Russia who oppose Ukraine, other actors from Russia who oppose Ukraine, who oppose the aggression, other actors from Russia who oppose the aggression, as well as different religious gender groups, women, youth, that are also in Ukraine, to simply hear what are the needs on a long run, what would be necessary for the Ukrainian culture and society to prosper into peace later on. And this comes with sacrifice when you're on the front line, because every time an actor would go out of the negotiating table, some sort of massacre will probably happen, because some standards, they will not agree to some standards, the red line goes up, and the talks are stopped. But the urge to push and collaborate and bring all these actors together, if not on the table, on the ground, to constantly incite talks about justice that goes beyond ICC and criminal justice, that would be, I think, the way to go on. But so far, the only thing that EU is doing when it comes to justice is focusing on pointing the finger for accountability of Russia with the ICC, and that's basically where it stops. I hope this answers.
Thanks. Maybe we hear from Nicole and Viktoriia. And,
Okay, sure, thank you. Oh, no, okay. So Kati, thank you for your question. And so I basically agree with what you said. On one level, it's how to proceed, right? How to proceed, and there is no kind of coherent position on how to proceed with enlargement, which is why I think the focus on all candidates have to meet all criteria in full is a kind of convenient way of kicking the can down the road, like a long way down the road. But so you also asked about does it have to do with the capacity to absorb? And there's like a lot being written on that, and there was a study by Tanya Bertzel and others, that basically made the case that those kinds of fears were overblown, right? That the EU does and did have the capacity to absorb, and that the Big Bang enlargement didn't overstretch the institutions, and it was fine, right? It was a challenge, but it was fine. So that was kind of overblown. But obviously it's still a concern. And so again, when I'm kind of looking at the rhetoric of different European parliamentary groups, it's interesting because the ones, as I said, like Renew and the Greens are the most pro-enlargement. That's, one red thread running through all of these manifestos I looked at was candidates have to meet the criteria. But another one was discussing enlargement in the context of internal reform. But so the ones that were most positive towards enlargement were framing it as we need internal reform and we need enlargement, and one should be the impetus for the other, and we should do both, and they should go hand in hand. And then you've got the kind of more cautious position that, and some of the bigger member states seem to express this from time to time, like France, like Macron, and even then having the idea of the European political community as a kind of in between, that, actually, no, we need to do the reform thing first, right? And then look at enlargement, which is another way of like seriously delaying enlargement. And then you've got the kind of more Eurosceptic voices in the parliament that took the view of enlargement should not be used as an excuse to deepen the EU. Like, we're watching out for that. Don't try to use enlargement as so there is no then coherent position. And of course, enlargement is one of these things that you need unanimity, right? So this lack of coherence just means that it falls back on, anyway, Ukraine is nowhere near meeting the criteria. So it's a problem we can delay for a long time. But then, then you even have these kinds of more current disputes like with Poland and the grain issue, right, which is like really depressing, right, because this is one of the EU member states that's been, most supportive of Ukraine. And even there, when it comes to something concrete that has like potentially a negative economic effect, it becomes a big problem. So the signs aren't good, basically, for coming up with a coherent pro-enlargement position.
Yeah, I can. Respond to that question. Thanks, Anna, for kind of asking that. Indeed, this NATO military chair of the military committee, he was actually also asking that question, saying basically now we have the need to fight for we in a world of me, because we have this individualism which is really kind of enshrined in our societies. And I think basically the kind of way how I see it, that we need to, first of all, start talking about it, and start explaining to students, what it means, security. And because, when I start this discussion with my students in Italy, they look at me sometimes as if I were crazy, it's really a kind of a bit novel topic, nobody talks about security and nobody talks about, threats to European security, okay? It's not about Ukraine, it's about European security. And here, I think, of course, you were connecting with these threats within European Union, right? Populism and destruction of democratic values within. And I think here we can actually do with some small steps, even kind of in countries where we live, like, in Italy. I am beyond academia also active in kind of, let's say, trying to signal some events which are actually kind of sponsored by Russia or Russian cultural associations in Italy, and which are complete pure propaganda, which tries actually to intervene into the Italian society, and tries to kind of build the narratives which are more reflecting actually Russian narratives. And I think we can we were signaling it like for the even members of the European Parliament from Italy, and then we were trying to stop this propaganda. So it's not about canceling, Russia as such, but it's about kind of signaling that these are hybrid threats which are inside Europe, which are trying to destroy our democracy and our values. And so we can do like small steps in this way as well. But I think, more in general, this is also the work for governments to do public diplomacy. Like Lithuanian, for example, foreign minister, he was doing an amazing job by speaking, to the society and by explaining it in a very simple way. And I think this is for other governments also to start this public diplomacy, to talk to people. And also, for example, Germany now, they have even this operational plan, 1,000 pages of plan, which is still secret, but this is also a plan how to prepare, for the security threats for companies, and for the broader society as such. And I think other countries should work in this area, and also through education, through preparation, and in general, public awareness of the issues which are actually threats for Europe and not only for Ukraine. This is my idea.
So I'll give the word to Dana now, and then I saw a couple more hands, so we'll do another quick round, and then I'll get back to you. Yeah, sorry, yeah. Go ahead.
Right, I just wanted to, some very interesting things have been raised, and I just want to say something about three of them: urgency, enlargement, and then the threat from within, from sort of right-wing populism. On urgency, this would have been, I think you have to, again, I would insist on looking at these things, politically and historically. And the fact is that the supposed complacency of wealthy European societies and EU members is now seen as like a mistake. But actually it was part of the original deal. It was part of the point. When the United States set out a policy of containment after World War II, containment of the Soviet threat, it saw that threat as mainly a political threat from communist parties inside Western Europe, supported by Moscow. When I say it, this was quintessentially what George Kennan was saying at the time. But I think it was a general idea that American protection, it's complicated because, as a matter of fact, the US was planning to leave almost immediately. but it didn't leave. And you develop this kind of tacit arrangement, and it was more than a tacit arrangement, where the United States was providing a large measure of European security, and Europe was rebuilding its society and rebuilding its infrastructure and building vibrant welfare states. And this was a tool in the Cold War. I mean, it was very consciously a tool in the Cold War. Now, it didn't prevent American presidents successfully complaining about inadequate defense spending. But I always used to say, you know, when there were arguments about the 2% threshold, the 2% standard for European defense spending pre-2022, if I were a member of the Bundestag, and I kept hearing American presidents saying that European security is a vital American interest, and I saw this massive American military establishment, I would make the perfectly rational and even moral judgment is I can spend more on social spending at home because I know the Americans are going to be there. And there was nothing wrong with this arrangement. As I say, it was part of the deal of the post-war American grand strategy to build up Europe. And part of that was with reduced, I mean, Europe actually was spending a lot of defense during the Cold War, but less than it would have been spending without the American support. So we have a new situation now, and that is obviously a situation provided by the threat from Russia, and we can argue about how far that threat goes, but also provided by what I describe as the threat from the United States, which is significant under Donald Trump. But I'm just saying historically, I don't think we go back and rewrite history and say, you know, the Europeans are responsible for their own bad situation. I mean, I think that, you know, that was actually part of the plan, but they have to change now. I certainly agree with that. On enlargement, you know, I mean, I take a somewhat more conservative view. I mean, I'm absolutely in favor of the European commitment to Ukrainian membership because of the war, because of the attack against Ukraine, because of the enormity of what this threat represents to what you might call European stability and European values. But enlargement does pose problems. So I don't think it's, Nicole, you said something that enlargement is one thing that Europe can do, but it has costs. And the costs come down to politics, the costs come down, you know, I'll give you one emblem of that cost in 2 words, Viktor Orban. Enlargement entails possible problems to the coherence of the European project. I think because of the threat posed by Russia that the Ukraine, I mean, you know, another example is, I mean, since before many of you were born, Turkey has been a candidate for what was even before there was an EU, for EU membership. I'm glad Turkey has not been admitted to the EU. Now, you know, some people will try to argue that this is because you know, the EU was too grudging in bringing it in. But I think, you know, we'd have talk about Viktor Orban if you had the current Turkish regime in the EU. So I just think there are trade-offs, and it's not that simple. And on the threat within the EU, I just think that you know, we have to think politically. I mean, we do have to think. I mean, these are parties. These are us. I mean, these are our parties. You know, some of them have affinities with Russia, and they have affinities with Trump. I say us. I'm not European, but I live in Europe. But you know, they have to be dealt with politically. I'm going to give you an example from the United States, which is probably not going to go over very well here, but. In the 2016 campaign, Kamala Harris and many of the candidates were presented by the American Civil Liberties Union with a questionnaire. And this questionnaire had to do with, I mean, it had a number of questions, but one of the questions, and I'm probably garbling it by using a Trump campaign ad to, you know, give a distorted version of what it was, but how it's been represented is, would you be in support of gender affirming medical care for, and I can't remember whether it was prisoners or asylum seekers in detention camps, but it was probably both. And Kamala Harris checked yes. And somebody who did not answer, refused to answer the questionnaire was Joe Biden, by the way. And you know, this was the subject of a very, very ugly Trump campaign ad, which, you know, it didn't have the effect. I mean, and it wasn't so much the transgender issue, I think, as the refugee issue. And it's something you have to take seriously. This was a big appeal of the Trump presidency. So it wasn't, you know, it wasn't sort of bigotry against transgender so much as a kind of insular idea reaction that why are we paying for medical care at all for people who shouldn't be in the United States. I just think you have to deal with these things politically. I think the ACLU should not have sent out that questionnaire. I mean, what was the point of that questionnaire? And that's
Great, thanks a lot. So we have another round of questions. I have Olga and Heidi. Olga and Joris, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Olga Budluk. I'm a colleague here at the University of Amsterdam in the Department of Political Science. And I want to compliment Giacomo and other organizers for putting together this fantastic panel. I loved how the different pockets of expertise added together into, you know, one conversation. It's just been a pleasure to listen. I have an anecdote to comment on a question. I'll be very brief. My anecdote was inspired by the remarks on individualism and on materiality of war and students. And in my head, it collided to the email I received this morning from a student, master student of mine. I currently teach a course on the EU and the post-Soviet states, and the student sent me an email. It's a male student, he's a gamer, and he said, Olga, I don't think you're a gamer, but I think you should know there's this huge scandal in the Stalker franchise where Ukrainian gamer developers just released a new Stalker. It's gone viral. There were like 1 million downloads in the first 24 hours. However, there's not a Russian version and not a Russian language version, and there's all sorts of like political codes in the symbols in the game. So Russians are now bomb reviewing it on the internet, blah, 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 blah. A long email. And it was, yeah, it's shocking that gamers like me in Ukraine are now operating drones and tanks and dying in the battlefield. And I read this long email and I wrote back like, yeah, you're totally old enough to die in battlefield. Actually, I'm old enough to be a mother of somebody who could die in battlefield. If I had a baby at 18, they'd be now military age. And, you know, I think we as teachers need to do a better job at bringing out the materiality of things and the politics of materiality of things. I think the whole political science debate went into, you know, this is the war of ideologies, this is the war of ideas, the war of narratives, discourses, which is the work I do as well. And I agree, this is at the root of it. However, it manifests in very material things, you know, that the different speakers brought out. And I think we need to do a better job to bring this out for the younger people and make it kind of relatable and concrete. My comment is on the final remark of Natasha, you know, ending with, you know, peace negotiations are nowhere to be seen, you know, and also other speakers were kind of going there. We need peace talks, we need maybe external incentives, we need to decide what to do with NATO, we need to decide about this and that. And I just felt compelled to set a few things straight. Ukraine has been effectively demilitarized since 1991. So there's this illusion that Ukraine is this military superpower that just needs to be demilitarized. It's been fully demilitarized. My father is a colonel of the Ukrainian army, and he explained to me that in 1991, just the Ukrainian Republic fraction of the Soviet army could provide 1 million soldiers to sustain for 6 months within 24 hours. That was the military capacity of Ukraine of Ukrainian Republic of the Red Army as of 1991. In 2014, when Russia moved into Crimea, the number was 9,000. And that's why Ukraine gave up Crimea, not because it was legitimately correct or Ukraine didn't want to fight. It did not have an army. And it only has an army because it's at war. So just to clarify that, there's also been 200 rounds of peace negotiations with Russia since 2014, 200 rounds of peace talks. It's not like Ukraine doesn't want to talk or nobody wants to mediate. There's been 200 rounds of talks and 2 ceasefires, which Russia did not comply with anything agreed. And there has been an external guarantee. Some of the speakers mentioned the Budapest Memorandum and other things. So just to clarify, set the facts straight. It's not like nobody came up with the good option. It's just none of them have been respected in the alternative legal order that Kostya talked about. And then the question, it's an invitation to reflect. I have it here, all of these as a precedent, all of this as part of the global war. So that's maybe 2 questions, right? All of this as precedent. We're talking, of course, the war is unique, and we're talking about this one case today, although other things have been mentioned as a lead up or, kind of correlated, etc. But I wonder, also in understanding your response to things, it's always important to remember that all of this is a precedent for something else, right? Russia is a precedent for other autocratic, totalitarian, violent, aggressive regimes. And the EU response is the precedent of Western response to other autocratic, totalitarian, violent regimes doing things elsewhere. To what extent it factors into your work? And I know that we simply, because of the attention deficit and time deficit and the level of empirical knowledge, it's impossible to be an expert on everything. But do you think in those terms? And kind of part of the same question, to what extent do you, for yourself, maybe privately, and you don't want to tell us here, think of this as a part of the global war, right? Because every war is treated isolated. There's a different department who was asking, which DG is dealing with this, which DG is doing that. Actually, in policy, departments, it will be different people dealing with different wars. However, it's the same countries fighting in the different wars, right? I mean, Russia's fighting in Mali and in Syria, and it's, gets the drone from Iran, which is fighting, in the everywhere. And now North Korean soldiers are already spotted in Ukraine. I mean, is this still a local war that we need to convince Europeans that it's actually a European war? Or is it a global war going on that now spilled out into Ukraine and is spilling out from there in the absence of a strong Western response? Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
How short was it?
Thank you. I have Heidi on the list and Yurislav. Maybe you can introduce yourself. I'm sorry, before I didn't ask people, but now people can introduce themselves. Hi.
I'm the researcher from Norway, which is super interesting to hear about your thoughts on Ukraine war. It's a lot to talk in Norway now about how much money we should give to the Ukrainian war effort, and we should obviously increase that, given how much money we earn on the oil price. But anyway, my question was actually on sort of a related geopolitical reality of the EU with regards to the green shift. And also the EU's need for raw material, but also rare minerals, and whether any of you share the thoughts that some are circulating that there might actually be a push to include the Ukraine in order to boost European self-sufficiency, etc., with regards to rare minerals, etc., and that might which Ukraine hasn't also, right? So there might be sort of a particular case for Ukraine as opposed to other potential members of the EU. What do you think about it?
Thank you.
Yes, Joris Larek from Leiden University. Also, thanks and congrats on it. Stop, son. Stand. No. Why do I have to stand up? Is it okay if I resist that? That's my question. Yes, okay. All right, so, yeah, so 2 questions. One to Natasha on transitional justice. So what in a scenario where, as unlikely as that may seem right now, but what if Ukraine wins, in a scenario where its territorial integrity gets restored or the occupied territories get liberated, what would the transitional justice process look like then? I'm sure maybe there's still like Russian-speaking minorities you have to involve, but how much in Russia do you need in that, or from your broader research on transitional justice? Is there any comparable case study to that, like an interstate conflict that ends in a successful liberation, and what does a transitional justice process look like then? I mean, I'm very interested to see how you gain that through. And one for Nicole as well, since you follow enlargement so closely, so I understand I think it's very unlikely it'll happen anytime soon with Ukraine, but what then about countries like Albania and North Macedonia, and there, but to use Natasha's metaphor, the carrot is still pretty fresh. There is some progress, a lot of political will, and no one can argue that the EU doesn't have the absorption capacity to integrate those smaller countries. So, as such, would you see that more likely in the coming years? And beyond that, wouldn't that, this kind of trickle approach to enlargement make it more likely then to also get Ukraine?
Yes, Katy,
Yes, sorry, I didn't introduce myself, and I know that we can leave Viktor Orbán until tomorrow, but I want to push back a little bit on the what you said about the enlargement. And I am familiar with the Tanya Berzor's study, but I am also familiar with the fact that most of the people who wrote about enlargement and post-enlargement are political scientists. And I don't have a very clear question for you, but I do feel that there is a question about legalism and how law is being used. And when you say absorbism, or what was it? So how are these
absorption capacity?
Yes. Legally, maybe yes, because the boxes have been ticked. They implemented the laws. Croatia had a little bit different accession process, but I think afterwards there were no processes. And what we see now, and indeed the Hungarian government is now the champion of that, accepting laws, this comes closer to what I am familiar with, that certain legislation is being adopted at the EU level, and Hungary goes to the Court of Justice and basically affects that using law. It reminded me very much what you said about the Russian Constitutional Court, etc., and making use of that. So I think that process, that 20 years, yes, political scientists looked at it, but also from the perspective of whether these new member states properly enforce these laws. Yes, but they have not looked at it how they properly and in an alternative way undermine it, etc., etc. And I think that indeed internally, and it's not just Hungary. I mean, Eastern Europe and the new member states are more than that. I think a proper process, or we don't know. Let's put it this way. I think there are hardly any legal scholars who looked into that.
Thank you. I'll also throw a question in, and that's about, and especially to the Ukrainians, or maybe all the framing of values, right? And the framing that Ukrainians are fighting for EU values. Which, at the beginning, it's very, I think it's been mobilizing in Ukraine and it's mobilizing in Europe, but I wonder, what do we think about that? I feel we may be seeing a bit less of that. Maybe I'm sure there is dark sides of that. Okay, so I wanted to bring that on the table. So maybe we can start with Nicole and go this way this time. And let's say we have, is there any other, otherwise each speaker gets 2 minutes and then we conclude this.
Okay, thanks for the questions and comments, and I can't, kind of comprehensively answer and respond. But, so Katia, I take your point, right, that and I think that the study by Bertel and all, and I think there is a bit of, kind of optimism, right, wanting to present it as a success story. I do think that's kind of part of it. So I take your point that the full scale of the challenge is not captured by these straightforward categories of, do they meet the, have they integrated and do they follow the rules? And the picture on compliance is mixed because some studies have said that, well, enlargement didn't have a net negative effect on compliance, and others say yes, and maybe it's too early to say. So, I take your point. I take your point on that. So what about the Western Balkans and is that more likely? Well, of course it should be. And yeah, the absorption concerns are not the same. Like Ukraine is a very big country and in a very difficult situation. So, it should be more likely. It should be more likely. But, North Macedonia, right? The carrot of enlargement, they changed the name of the country, right? Yeah, and so, and then Bulgaria has this, you have to say your language is not a real language, so yes, of course, it should be more likely. And if some smaller states were to join, I think it should help Ukraine's case. But there always seems to be another hurdle. Which, going back to Kati's point, so as the EU expands, then you know, you need unanimity for further enlargement, and then that gets harder and harder, right? So it's one of the relatively new member states in Bulgaria that now is the main sticking point for North Macedonia, right? So, yeah, there is a lack of coherence. And just very briefly, so Dana, you said that, you know, enlargement is not without costs. And so I agree as well with what you said, right? And I take your point. And I've kind of got an ongoing, you know, when I presented some version of this last year at a gathering in Prague, and there was a colleague who kind of pushed back with the view that Ukraine joining the EU is just simply not realistic, and it shouldn't have been offered. It shouldn't have been offered. And I kind of find that hard to accept, but I can see his point. And I suppose just the worst combination is offering it and then doing nothing to realize it, right? Just letting the carrot rot is the worst possible combination. And if that was going to happen, then I have to kind of reluctantly concede that he may have had a point, right, this colleague, that it would have been better not to offer enlargement at all.
Yeah, maybe I can follow on that with regard to, yes, EU absorption capacity. And of course, we know Article 7 cases against Hungary and Poland. And indeed, I think as lawyers, right, kind of we understand that to some extent the European Union was kind of weak of let's say enforcing it and pushing, you know, kind of Hungary and using like tools, you know, which we already have inside the EU to put its house in order. And this, of course, you know, your point is really very good when you are saying, well, we want to be sure that kind of we don't destroy then European Union when we have other countries which then can reverse on what they enter, what they agree when they enter. But I think, you know, I can add also on the cost. Well, of course, it comes with the cost. But, you know, maybe it's a bit more rhetoric and more related to what Giacomo said about values. I think, you know, there is a political cost, but I think Europeans should also realize that, again, there is this geopolitical maybe interest, and there is the security element to the accession of Ukraine, because now for values, Ukrainians are actually dying. And I think the kind of if Ukrainians had to choose, you know, kind of whether to, I mean, if Europeans, let's say, had to choose whether to accept Ukraine and to pay this cost maybe politically, or then maybe if Russia goes further, or if it evolves and it goes kind of broader to Baltic and further, then there will be a higher cost. Like, you know, I have Estonians who are coming to Ukraine and who are bringing the military support, I mean, kind of cars, very small support to Ukraine, but they are saying we are paying now this cost because we know then the cost will be higher, and cost will be in human lives. So maybe I will stop on this.
There was a very good question about the extent to which this is part of a global war.
Oh, yeah.
And very clearly, part of Russia's resilience is its ability to call on a hinterland of China. It now has North Korean troops, but it has military supplies from North Korea and Iran. But how you deal with this, I think, is a more complicated question. I mean, you know, I'll tell you one person who likes to talk about a global war, and that's Benjamin Netanyahu. But of course, I'm surprised in a way that Gaza hasn't come up yet. But if the Europeans or the United States joins that rhetoric that we're in a global war against Iran and the rest of the axis, and we're fighting it in Gaza, and we're supporting Israel and fighting Iran in Gaza, and there's an element of truth to that, by the way. The scale of what's being done in Gaza just is so enormous and so horrible that it just makes total nonsense of that argument. So I think you need to be careful with the concept of global war, while at the same time recognizing that these countries are more closely aligned than they were. The other reasons to be careful about it is, frankly, it's a standard principle of strategy to unite your allies and divide your enemies. This, by the way, was a long-standing argument against NATO enlargement because you were driving Russia into China's arms. Well, it's too late for that, and I wouldn't blame it on NATO enlargement, but I think there's still a case to be made for diplomacy with China so that it's not a complete embrace. I mean, I think China has interests in the world, interests in Europe, interests in the United States that can be used if you don't look at it as one sort of uniform axis of evil. On absorption, well, I mean, I just want to make very clear, I think that the membership process for Ukraine should proceed. I think that is a commitment that the European Union made, perhaps in haste, perhaps in an emotional moment, but one that recognized the enormity of the security and values attack that occurred on the 22nd of February 2022. But the more countries, when I talk about costs, I'm talking about to the coherence of an organization that will not in my lifetime, and frankly, I do not believe ever be a federal union. So it's always going to be a union of sovereign independent states. You reminded me of another problematic when we talked about the change of the name to North Macedonia. Reminds me of another enlargement project to Greece. Before Orban, there was Greece bullying around Macedonia because of its own historical kind of insecurities and obsessions. And that was a consequence of enlargement to Greece. That's right.
Okay, yes, so I will use this round to also contribute a bit further on Paul's question, something that I forgot to answer, and then I will link that to answer yours question. So what can EU also do when it comes to human-centered approach to transitional justice and to justice in Ukraine is basically learn from the Council of Europe. So the Council of Europe has come up with a strategy action plan for Ukraine entitled Resilience, Recovery and Reconstruction. Vis-a-vis that, the EU, the most funding that is given from the EU comes when it goes towards military enforcement. And also what the Council of Europe has done is it has established a register for damage caused by the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, which is the register that gathers claims of victims for reparations, and it will later on delve into a mechanism that will legally deal with those claims and provide reparation for Ukrainian victims. EU is to some degree into this process, but it's not like the head of the process, right? So I'm going to link this to answer yours question. How do I envision, do we have any positive examples? To begin with, this is a unique case. This is the first time that transitional justice processes have begun during the conflict in a kind of international conflict rather than internal conflict. So Colombian case, North Macedonia, that was all internal conflict. So this is a unique case. So we cannot link from one single positive case from the past. So we have to gather experiences from all different positive aspects. So to begin with, I would address, let's say, there are 4 elements of transitional justice, right? So the first aspect would be, I'm going to start with what I already answered, the reparation. And when it comes to reparations, so we start with the Council of Europe's registry, but then we continue with empowering local funds and local systems to gather these claims and address victims' claims, as well as civil claims when it comes to not only reparations of money, but civil claims of victimized people who, because of the war, haven't been able to fully integrate within the society. Would it be social rights, economic rights, education, etc. So starting from funds from outside, but then building the society to be sustainable on its own to address these claims. Similarly, when it comes to accountability, then we can use the example from Kosovo. So internationalized courts. So firstly, to empower the system to work on its own. But also, as I always say, when it comes to transitional justice, a couple of generations need to die for full democracy to happen, because we have brainwashed heads that are in the courts. So vetting is also crucial. But establishing a system and laws that will decide on impunity cases and on reparation cases from an objective standpoint of view. 1 minute, I need less. Truth, when it comes to truth, finding the truth, that's crucial. What happened with Bucha, finding the families of the bodies by people through Facebook is unacceptable. But it can happen on the battlefield. When it comes to peace, then mechanisms for establishing truth that would work in alignment with the registry for claims should be established. A positive example would be the example of RECOM, where EU had a crucial role in putting all former Yugoslav heads of states of all the former Yugoslav republics, including Kosovo and Serbia, together to come and shape a truth commission for establishing the truth on what has happened during the Balkan Wars. The mandate of such commission should be very limited because it can go forever and forever, and then the goal of it would not be established. Crucially, though, I would say the main point of how I envision transitional justice would be active engagement with the youth and with other groups that are to be directly inflicted by the reforms that are about to happen. Why I say this? It is because in the Balkans we see now kind of post-nationalism where youth are being brainwashed because vetting hasn't happened. So the perpetrators have become heroes and now they're leading the countries, including media. So media freedom, but also control, institutional rebuilding, truth establishing, and active engagement with the triggered groups, and especially with youth through educational reforms as well.
Thanks, Natasha. And Kostya.
Yeah, very brief.
Did somebody reply to Olga's question? You're going to.
Very. Yeah,
there was one
very
before,
briefly. Yes. Very briefly, and I want to link some things together from what was being said. And I would like to start with the price of offering the membership. Yeah, that was discussed a couple of times. I think another side of this is also to talk about the price of not offering it and not accepting Ukraine to the EU, because we talk about values and dying for values, but there is, at least in Ukrainian military, from what I know, there is this values fatigue in a way, when Ukrainian soldiers are saying, like, we're not dying for or because of values, we're dying because we're being killed. As simple as that, right? So, and that, I think, is already a risk, because there seems to be a lot of talk about values but little action, on the side of the EU. And I think admitting Ukraine to the EU as a member state is, in a way, maybe a way of ensuring it's backsliding, because never say never. I mean, Georgia was invaded by Russia in 2008, but now is heading at full speed towards Russia, towards alliance with Russia. I mean, that may or may not still happen, but at least the signs are there. And who knows, maybe if Ukraine remains in this limbo, with its quite a powerful military and experience in, 15, 20 years, becoming an alliance with Russia, that is a much bigger threat than, and that would require a much higher price to wear off than admitting Ukraine. And continue on the topic of values. I think there is this weird paradox of values, right? A paradox that has to do with what are the values of the European Union. And, from Article 2 that was mentioned, These are values that are somehow premised upon and prioritize status quo. Yeah, so this is the rule of law, democracy, human rights, and so on and so on. And of course, that makes sense why they prioritize status quo, because this is what capitalism and liberalism, what they demand, right? Stability and predictability, foreseeability, and so on and so on. So that makes sense. But if the values are such, then you inevitably encounter paradox that in order to fight for those values, you need to temporarily suspend them. And this is, I don't think that this is something that Europeans are necessarily ready to do. And this, I think, links to what Olga mentioned. You know, how do we explain even like that, hey, there might actually be war here? Because I think there are two basic reactions here that you can expect. One is, okay, fighting for those values. That is possible. I don't think everyone is ready to do that, but maybe some are. But another is to just withdraw and just say, okay, we are going to enjoy our values here and there, but why should we bother about? Yeah, so let's preserve the status quo as it is, and let's try to pretend that that doesn't threaten us. And it seems to be that this is becoming much more normalized in the EU than it was in 2022.
Well, thanks a lot to our panelists.